Good morning, everyone. Let me add my welcome to Stephanie's. I'm glad you're all with us. And we are going to be studying working with others today. So if you have your big book, we are on page 89. And I love the first sentence here because they tell us practical experience shows nothing will so much ensure immunity from drinking or binging as intensive work with other alcoholics or compulsive eaters. So I love that word immunity, right? Like if we think of a vaccine, we get a vaccine so that we have immunity against an illness. And this is the only place in the book where it tells us we will have immunity against compulsive eating. That means it's like we are safe and protected and the illness can't touch us. We are immune to the illness touching us. Intensive work with others. So how do we do this? And they tell us this works when other activities fail. So that does not mean we go to one meeting and then say, okay, I'm going to work intensively with other compulsive eaters, right? Because there's a requirement to sponsor, to help others. And it says in step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to other compulsive eaters. So we need to have that spiritual awakening, and we get that as a result of the steps. It's so cool, right? Step 12 starts with a promise. We will become spiritually awakened as a result of working these steps. And they tell us our 12th suggestion, because they're assuming we've done the first 11, carry this message to other compulsive eaters. This message that like recovery is possible, working a 12-step process that leads to a miracle. And it says, you can help when no one else can. You can secure their confidence when others fail. Remember, they are very ill, not bad. That means as a sponsor, we should never berate someone or yell at someone if they end up eating compulsively. They have an illness. We wouldn't yell at someone who has pneumonia who's coughing because coughing is a symptom of pneumonia. Eating compulsively is a symptom here. So we never want to be mean to anybody. And then they give us this great promise for us. Life will take on new meaning. You'll see others recover. You'll see others help others. Loneliness will vanish. A fellowship will grow up about you. And they say, this is an experience you must not miss. We know you will not want to miss it. And I thought, well, how do they know what I'm going to want or not want? How do they know I'm not going to want to miss it? Because they know that if I've worked these steps, my heart isn't selfish anymore, or at least not as selfish as it used to be, and that I will really want to be with others and really want to carry the message. And they say frequent contact with newcomers and each other is the bright spot of our lives. So if anyone is feeling down in the dumps, contact with other compulsive eaters and trying to help newcomers, that'll brighten up our day. And then it gives us a little advice. And remember, this book was written before there were all these meetings. So a lot of times, the way they found people to work with is they would go to their local doctor, their local hospital, and say, is there anyone here who's suffering, who's a drunk who you can't help? And they would try to help him. But there's still a few principles here to follow. They say don't start out as an evangelist or a reformer. An evangelist is someone who is like really gung ho on convincing people of their point of view. No, we don't have to. Or a reformer. It's not my job to go to all the eating disorder programs. There's so many that have sprung out of OA that are similar to OA or, something different. It's not my job to reform them, to go in and tell them. And it just says you can be uniquely helpful to others. So cooperate, never criticize. So again, that extends to how other people want to recover. We don't criticize. Remember, our book says we have no monopoly on God. We merely have an approach that worked with us. They say to be helpful is our only aim. So page 90, all we want to do is be helpful. And then they just say, okay, when you meet a prospect, find out all you can about him. So we don't just like someone raises their hand, we need a sponsor, and we say, yes, I'm a sponsor. And then we just start giving them stuff to do. No, we want to find out all we can about them. And here's the first thing it says. If he does not want to stop drinking, don't waste time trying to persuade him. Now, real important, sometimes someone will say to me, I must not want to stop. And I'm like, well, how come? Like, then why are you here? And they say, well, I must not want to stop because I'm still in the food. I'm like, mm. There's a difference between not wanting to stop and wanting to stop, but not being able to. So I say, if your fairy godmother could come here and wave a magic wand and remove your food obsession, would you want her to? Two times people have said no, believe it or not. They've like, no. But most times people are like, yes, I want to stop, but I can't. So it's very important. So sometimes if someone says, I don't want to stop, what they really mean is, I want to, but I can't. So we have to differentiate between that. And they tell us, get an idea of his behavior, his problems, his background, the seriousness of his condition, his religious leanings. So these are all things we want to find out about the person. Is this their first OA meeting, or have they been here for 20 years and had 50 different sponsors? We want to get an idea of things. Their religious leanings. I want to know if the person believes in God, right? So that's important for me to know. And then they tell us sometimes it's wise to wait till he goes on a binge, but it's better to risk it. How come? Because if people feel hopeless, they're more likely to want to do this work. If someone says, well, I used to binge, but now I've got 2 weeks and things are going fine, they may not be all that interested. So we want to get people when they feel hopeless. And they say, have a family member or friend, ask him if he wants to quit for good and if he would go to any extreme to do so. So again, we're usually not going through a third party to talk to a potential sponsee. We're usually talking to that person ourselves. But we do want to find out, do you want to quit for good? Not just like to look good for your high school reunion so that boy who dumped you when you were 17 feels bad. No, do you want to quit for good? And are you willing to go to any lengths to do so? And that's right out of page 58. They really tell us not everyone is entitled to a sponsor. Say, if you have decided you want what we have, and again, what do we have? A spiritual awakening or a spiritual experience as the result of these steps, and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, then, and I say then and only then, are you ready to take certain steps. But again, if this is someone new, he or she might not be familiar with what it means. So we want to talk to them. They say, if they're not interested, okay, don't try to force them. We don't try and say, but you really should do this. It doesn't work if we chase somebody. Page 91, again, they say, he may be more receptive when depressed. So we don't want to give false hope. We don't want to say, don't worry, just keep coming back, it'll get better. I spent 7 years going to OA meetings. I kept coming back, but I didn't do this work and I didn't get better. In fact, I got worse. I got progressively worse. And nobody ever sat me down during that time and said, this is hopeless and it's going to keep getting worse. Maybe if they had, wouldn't have taken me 7 years. So we don't want to give false hope. Like, don't worry, just, keep coming to meetings and do nothing else and it'll get better. We can't recover from any illness by osmosis. Okay. And then again, page 91, that paragraph that starts, see your man alone at possible. It says what we should talk about. Tell them about yourself, right? The person needs to kind of get to know us. People never like to feel like they're projects. Like, okay, I've met you at a meeting. Here's a food plan. Here's a big book. Call me in the morning. No, like we want to develop a relationship with them. So it says, what do? We talk about ourselves, how we used to binge, my experience. Just start to kind of whet the person's appetite so that he or she will ask ultimately, what'd you do to get better? We want to tell some of the awful things we did around food, how we stole food, how we stole money for food. It says if he's in a light mood, tell him humorous stories about your escapades. I don't have many humorous stories about binging because, they involve large amounts of food in my head over a toilet bowl, but I have one, so I'll tell you guys. I was away in another country, junior year abroad, and we stayed at this host family for a weekend, and the hostess baked this cake. And, everyone was taking a nap in the afternoon, and my friend and I ate the entire cake. And the hostess woke up and she's like, gosh, I could have sworn I baked a cake today. She's like, she had no clue where the cake went. And we're just like, oh, yeah, don't worry about it. And that poor woman, like, gosh, I thought I baked a cake, but there's no trace of it. Of course, with compulsive eaters in the house, there's not going to be a trace. So then it says, when he sees you know all about the drinking game, all about the eating game, commence to describe yourself as an alcoholic, a compulsive eater. Page 92, it says, tell him how you were baffled, how you finally learned you were sick, the struggles you made to stop. Like, yes, I went to this pay and way and I tried this and I did this and nothing worked. And then, very important, it says, show him the mental twist which leads to the first drink of a spree. If you've been around, you've heard me talk about this, that we, unlike normal people, there is a disconnect, a broken bridge between our memory and our conscious mind where we make our decisions. So we cannot bring to our conscious mind the memories of the suffering and humiliation of past months. It's like the thought can't get across. If you're interested, we have a one-page handout that explains the broken bridge on our website under other resources. Stephanie will put the link in the chat. But it's very important if we're going to help someone that we understand what a first step is, what the broken bridge is, what the mental twist is, because that's what leads to the first bite, not the allergy to sugar or whatever, right? Like I have an allergy to cats. I just stay away from cats. Problem solved. I don't need to go to Cats Anonymous. Right? So there is something more than a physical problem. There's a mental twist. Okay. So we need to really understand that and be able to explain it, be able to articulate it. Page 92, again, it says, if you're satisfied he's a real alcoholic, real compulsive eater, dwell on the hopeless feeling of the malady, that the mental condition prevents the normal function of the willpower. I have willpower when it comes to staying away from cats, but I didn't have any willpower when it came to staying away from cookies. Just didn't have it. Again, they say continue to speak of alcoholism, compulsive eating, as an illness, a fatal malady. Talk about the conditions of body and mind which accompany it. So they're saying that the conditions of our body, the allergy, and our mind, the mental twist, are accompaniments. They're like side dishes. Well, what's the root of this illness then? And it's really a spiritual illness, right? In chapter 5, they say, once the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. So it's solved on a spiritual basis, and that results in a mind that works and in a body that's healthier. And they say, you can talk about the hopelessness of this because you offer the solution. And then what is the solution? Page 93. They say, tell them how you got well. Stress the spiritual feature freely. I cannot emphasize that strongly enough. Stress the spiritual feature freely. So sometimes, and the spiritual feature, they come right out and they say they need a conception of God. It can be what their own conception, provided it makes sense. So a couple things. A doorknob does not make sense because how can a doorknob infuse me with power? And even the group cannot make sense. You all may love me, you cannot give me one bit of power. So it says the person has to choose a concept of God that makes sense to him. So it has to make sense. But the main thing is that he's willing to believe in a power greater than himself. So a person may say, I don't believe in God, but I'm willing to entertain the thought that maybe there's a God. Good enough. If a person says, I know there's no God and I don't even want to talk about it, I don't even want to think about it, I want no solution that involves God, I got nothing else for you. So, willing to believe in a power greater than himself and that he live by spiritual principles. And what are the spiritual principles? Basically, self-sacrifice for the good of other people. Karen M. made a list of all the spiritual principles that are in the big book, and they are on our website. So, Steph, if you could place that link in the chat. When it says stress the spiritual feature freely, sometimes people will ask, well, what if a person doesn't believe in God? Can't we start smaller? Can't we start with, okay, you can use the group as a higher power until you believe in God? Or you can use, something else. Well, to that, I would say, like, if I went to the doctor and I had pneumonia, and the doctor said, you've got pneumonia and it's pretty serious, you need a high dose of penicillin. And I said, you know what? I don't like antibiotics. Would any doctor ever say, okay, let's start slower. Let's start you on vitamin C? No doctor would ever, I would hope, no doctor would ever do that. So we don't tell them something that isn't the solution. Remember when Ebby went to see Bill and Bill said, what happened? And he just said, I've got religion. He didn't sugarcoat God. So we don't either. Now, again, a person can be whatever religion they like or no religion. I have sponsored people who are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, no religion whatsoever. It doesn't matter. As long as they have a concept of God that makes sense to them. And if they say, well, a doorknob makes sense to me, I would ask them to please explain how a doorknob can infuse a person with power, because that's our solution. God gives us some of his power, like a pick line of grace going into our hearts. Okay, and it says, again, page 93, be careful, of the language you use. Don't use big theological terms and conceptions. So I'm probably not going to talk about the incarnation or, things like that. We're just about like, there is a God, he exists. It's possible to have a relationship with him. And the 12 steps show us how to do it in a simple and easy way. And says, okay, what if this person is pretty religious and knows more than you do about religion? It's like, so if you're sponsoring someone and they've got like a PhD in theology, it doesn't matter. It says, he will be curious to learn why his own convictions haven't worked and why yours seem to work so well. So first, that's a mark of humility, that someone who's had a lot of religious training and is curious to say, okay, but something's not working because I'm still in the food. And then they tell us this person may be an example of the truth. Faith alone is insufficient. To be vital, to be alive, faith has to be accompanied by self-sacrifice and unselfish constructive action. And that's what these 12 steps are all about. Self-sacrifice, unselfish constructive action. And you can tell the person, yeah, you may know way more about religion than I do, but no matter what your faith and knowledge, you couldn't have applied it or you would not be binging. And, I had this conversation with someone yesterday, and she said, my relationship with God is good in all areas except the food. And I called this to her mind, and, she was humble enough to say, you're right. Maybe my relationship with God isn't everything I thought it could be. I always believed in God. I was brought up to believe in God. My entire life, I believed in God. But it made no difference to me it was like I didn't care what he thought. I mean, I learned about it, but it's like it was irrelevant. I didn't base any decisions on my life on what God might or might not want from me. So I guess I was a practical agnostic. And they tell us we don't represent any particular faith or denomination. We're dealing with principles common to most denominations. So, page 94, outline the program of action, talk about basically how you work the steps, and that it's important for him to realize that my attempt to pass this on to the other person plays a vital part in my own recovery. Right? I'm not doing this because I'm Mother Teresa. I'm doing this because if I don't, I'm going to be back in the food again. And it says, he may be helping you more than you're helping him. Because if I had no one to talk to, I wouldn't have opportunities to be unselfish and do self-sacrifice. So we have to realize that this person is helping us. Even if he doesn't ever recover, that person has still helped us because they've given us an opportunity to be unselfish and self-sacrificing. And we have to tell the person they're under no obligation to us. Just because I may be the first person that someone called, it doesn't mean she has to pick me as a sponsor. If she calls someone else the next day and likes her better, no obligation to me. I got to get my ego out of it. And it says what we do, what we tell the person. There's no obligation, right? No money, no obligation. We only hope that when you get better, you'll help other compulsive eaters for free. And if you want to get better, it is important to place the welfare of others ahead of your own. Those are the things we need to tell people. We hope that when you get better, you'll help other people for free. And if you want to get better, you need to start placing the welfare of others ahead of your own. Um, so it's like no pressure if you don't want to see me again. And they say, well, okay, your candidate may give reasons why he doesn't need to do it. Okay, if someone gives reasons why not, we don't argue with them and just say, you know what? I uh I tried to do it my own way for a while, but it didn't work. It says if they haven't read the book, lend them a book so that they read what this program is about. Page 95, give them a chance to think it over. So I usually have 2 meetings with prospective sponsees. I did a podcast called Building a Bridge to God, which really explains the first step, in my opinion, and kind of the way I look at the steps. So I asked them to listen to that, and then we come back and we talk about it. And I say, that's kind of my approach to the steps. So they know I'm not going to mince words about God. And then we talk, I get to know her, she gets to know me, then have her do something in the doctor's opinion. We come back, we work on it together, we work through it together. So we're starting to do some work in the book. And then I tell her, these are the things that I require of my sponsees. I have 6 things that I ask my sponsees to do. And I say, now, go take the night and think about it. And sometimes she'll say, no, 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 I'm sure I want to go ahead. I'm like, that's great. I hope you do. But I still want you to take the night and think about it. And, often people come back, yes, but I've been surprised. Sometimes people who I were positive were going to come back and say, yes, say, you know what, I thought about it. I'm not ready. I'm not willing, or I don't want it to be with you or something. It's fine. I got to do self-sacrifice in working with the person. Again, page 95, that first paragraph, it says, we don't rush people. If he has trouble later, he is likely to say you rushed him. We don't want to rush people. Like, you need to make a decision right now. You will be most successful with alcoholics, with compulsive eaters, if you don't exhibit any passion for crusade or reform. Never talk down to a compulsive eater from a moral or spiritual hilltop. I'm not any better than anyone else. I just may have got on the bus 1 stop before the next person. Doesn't make me any better. Lay out the kit of spiritual tools for his inspection. And what are the spiritual tools? The 12 steps. Show him how they worked with you. Offer him friendship and fellowship, even if he doesn't want to keep working this program. People are still allowed to come to meetings. We're still friendly. And then tell him if he wants to get well, you will do anything to help. And then they tell us if he's not interested in your solution, if he expects you to give him money or just be someone he or she can call whenever they go on a binge, you may have to drop him until he changes his mind. This does not say that if we're sponsoring someone and he or she picks up, we are supposed to automatically drop them and tell them to go hear a new voice. No, no, we try to help them, right? Now, just as a tangent, what I do is if someone picks up, I go over what's happened and we can usually diagnose why. If they have been doing everything I've told them to do, again, we look and see why. If they have not been doing everything I asked them to do, we talk about why not. And I'm like, you really need to do this. Otherwise, it says to me you're not willing to go to any lengths. And according to page 58, I can't sponsor you. So again, we do not automatically drop someone just because she picks up. Okay. If the person is sincerely interested, ask them to read this book in the interval, right? The person has to be familiar what's in this book. And then the person should not be pushed or prodded. And then look at this beautiful line. If he is to find God, the desire must come from within. That is our solution, the only solution we have to offer, finding God. We say, if the person thinks they can do it another way, another spiritual approach, another sponsor, great. We say, follow your conscience. We don't have a monopoly on God. We merely have an approach that works. All good. Page 96 says, don't be discouraged if the person doesn't respond. Search out someone else. You are sure to find someone desperate enough to accept with eagerness what you offer. Those are the people who are sponsorable. Someone who is desperate, who is willing to go to any length and is eager and doesn't like fight back on everything. Right? And it says, we find it a waste of time to keep chasing a man who cannot or will not work with you. To spend too much time on any one situation is to deny another alcoholic an opportunity to live and be happy. So if we're sponsoring people who keep picking up, who aren't willing to go to any lengths, I think we need to ask ourselves, why am I doing that? Do I not want to have a hard conversation? Do I have ego about all the people I'm sponsoring? Am I living in, a false reality saying this time they'll be different because we really care about the person? So I'm responsible to God to how I use my time. So it says, suppose you're making your second visit to a man. He has read this volume and says he is prepared to go through with the 12 steps. Those are the people we sponsor. They're familiar with this program. And again, if they're brand new, if it's someone's first meeting, you might want to give them a big book and ask them to read the book so they understand what this program is. They say, we're supposed to help people, but be careful the person isn't trying to impose upon you for money, connections, or shelter. Permit that and you only harm him. So someone wants me as a sponsor just because they think that being connected to me, makes them okay. They're imposing on me for connection and I'm harming them if I allow it. Page 97 tells us we don't avoid our responsibilities, but it says, be sure you're doing the right thing if you assume them. Helping others is the foundation stone of your recovery. So that is the foundation of our recovery, helping others. How much? Well, they say a kindly act once in a while isn't enough. You have to act the Good Samaritan every day if need be. If you don't know who the Good Samaritan is and you want to look them up, you can go to a New Testament. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, talks about the Good Samaritan. So here's something, the Good Samaritan. He gave up money. He was willing to be inconvenienced and uncomfortable. And he did self-sacrifice. Okay? And they tell us what the founders of AA went through. Listen to this. A drunk may smash the furniture in your home or burn a mattress. You may have to fight with an alcoholic who's violent. You may have to give them a sedative under a doctor's direction. You may have to send for the police or an ambulance. Okay, I don't think any of us goes through anything even remotely like that. But here's what we need to do. If I'm watching as much Netflix as I want to, I'm not doing enough work and self-sacrifice. Not saying I can't watch any Netflix, but if I'm watching as much TV as I want, if I'm lounging around as much as I want, I'm probably not doing enough self-sacrifice. So page 97, they tell us that about something about a family. So I think this is good for us in our own families. Should a family practice spiritual principles, there's a much better chance that the head of the family will recover. And even though he continues to drink, the family will find life more bearable. So if I've got difficult people in my house, right, and I practice spiritual principles, love, self-sacrifice, biting my tongue when I want to say something, then one of two things will happen, and maybe both. Either the other person and people will start getting better, which of course they will because there's less tension around the house. And even if they don't, I will be able to bear it. Beautiful promise, a double promise there. Then they say, for the person who's able and willing to get well, little charity in the ordinary sense of the word is needed or wanted. So it says, we have to make sure that the person doesn't rely on our assistance more than on God. And then this is so cool. Job or no job, wife or no wife. We simply don't stop drinking, binging, as long as we place dependence upon others ahead of dependence on God. If I call my sponsor up with a problem, inevitably the first thing she says is, did you go to God with it? And it says we can't place dependence on others ahead of dependence on God. Okay, specifically, how do we depend on God? We pray and meditate for guidance. We take the action that we think God would have us take, and we leave whatever results happen up to Him. And then they tell us what a sponsor's job is. Burn the idea into the consciousness of every man that he can get well regardless of anyone. The only condition is that he trust in God and clean house. Well, we have to help the person trust in God. We've got some podcasts, some stuff that could be helpful for that. Trust in God, because once we trust in God, we can surrender to God in step 3. And then we clean house in steps 4 through 9. And then we just live our lives doing these steps pretty much on a daily basis, surrendering, praying and meditating, get closer to God, clearing up the wreckage of each day, and helping others. And then they give us some tidbits of advice for us and that we can give our sponsees. That so even if our families are difficult, it says he should not be concerned about that. He should concentrate on his own spiritual demonstration. Argument and fault finding are to be avoided like the plague. So I was thinking about it, like when COVID was here, the modern plague, what did a lot of us do? We wore masks. What do masks do? They cover our mouth. When others are annoying us, we can keep our mouths shut, right? We can stop. Argument and fault finding are to be avoided like the plague. We concentrate on our own spiritual demonstration. So what I advise my sponsees is until they're through the steps, unless their husband or, people in their family are doing something dangerous, we let it go. We don't say a word. After we make our amends, then it can be different. And it says, okay, your wife or family may be difficult, but we still have to practice these principles at home if any results are to be expected. And then a beautiful promise, if persisted in for a few months. So for a few months, I'm committed to no argument, no fault finding, and my own spiritual demonstration. It says, the effects on a man's family is sure to be great. What a beautiful promise. The most incompatible people discover they have a basis upon which they can meet. Little by little, the family may see their own defects and admit them. So, me admitting my defects makes it easier for other people in my house to admit theirs. And it says, these things will happen as long as we continue to demonstrate that we can be sober, considerate, and helpful no matter what. And says, we all fall below this standard. It says much below this standard many times. But we must try to repair the damage immediately, lest we pay the penalty by a spree. So that means if I am not acting in a way that's sober, considerate, and helpful in my family, doesn't matter how helpful I am to people in OA, I am going to binge. So if I keep causing wreckage in my family and don't fix it, I'm going to binge. So what's the solution? To start all over with a new sponsor at step one? No. Stop causing wreckage in my own house. Stop causing wreckage. Bottom of page 99 says, let no alcoholic, compulsive eater say he cannot recover unless, right? We all have our unless we have our family back, unless we get this job, unless my kids do what I want them to. Remind the prospect his recovery is not dependent on people or circumstances. Circumstances or other people's actions never are the cause of my relapse. My recovery is dependent, top of page 100, upon my relationship with God. 100% on my relationship with God. And then the most beautiful paragraph. Both you and the new man must walk day by day in the path of spiritual progress. So even once we're through the steps, we need to keep walking in the path of spiritual progress. If you persist, remarkable things will happen. Here's my second favorite line in the big book. When we look back, we realize that the things which came to us when we put ourselves in God's hands were better than anything we could have planned, right? So imagine I take a piece of paper and I write down all my plans. Well, God's plans are going to be even better than that because his resources, his imagination are so much more than mine. So I want his list, not my list. And then a conditional promise. Follow the dictates of a higher power. So we do God's will, and the result is you will presently live in a new and wonderful world, no matter what your present circumstances. God can overcome hard circumstances. Bottom of page 100, it says, if we're spiritually fit, we can do all sorts of things that alcoholics are not supposed to do, right? You know, people say, oh, don't have sugar in your house. Don't go to friends' houses if they have sugar. Don't see movies that have food in them. And it says, yeah, this is not necessarily so. That an alcoholic who can't meet these conditions still has an alcoholic mind. So again, at the beginning, it is wise to avoid temptation. Early on, we avoid places, we don't walk into a Haagen-Dazs to use a payphone, right? We want to be smart about it. But as a result of working these steps, it's telling us we're going to be able to go to places we didn't think we can. If we can't, we still have the compulsive eater mind. And they tell us we don't try to shield other people. If we're going someplace, we ask ourselves, bottom of page 101, have I any good social, business, or personal reason for going to this place? Or am I expecting to steal a little vicarious pleasure from the atmosphere of these places? It says, look at your answer. Make sure your motive is thoroughly good. Now, here's a rule for any place we go. Do not think of what you will get out of the occasion. Think of what you will bring to it instead. Great way to go to our work, in our relationships, everything. They say if you're shaky, don't go to that place of temptation. Work with another alcoholic instead. And if you're new in recovery, go find a way to be helpful instead. Page 102, your job now is to be at the place where you may be of maximum helpfulness to others. That's our sense of purpose. Go where we can be of maximum helpfulness to others. And then they say, okay, what about keeping liquor in our home? Or we may say keeping, I don't know, candy or something in our home. And they say, some of us serve it to our friends if they're not alcoholic. Some people think we should never serve liquor or sugar to anyone. They say, we never argue this question. Page 103, we are careful never to show intolerance or hatred of drinking as an institution, or I say of sugar as an institution. We don't get on the bandwagon about the evils of sugar. I mean, I can't go near cats. That doesn't mean that cats are evil. It just means I have an allergy and I can't go near them. And it says, every new alcoholic looks for the spirit of intolerance among us and is relieved when he finds we are not witch burners. What are witch burners? People who say, if you're not like me, you're evil. So we don't do that. We don't say that about other people's food plans, about how people work the program. We don't do that. A spirit of intolerance might repel alcoholics or compulsive eaters whose lives could have been saved had it not been for such stupidity. So I really, have to be smart about this. I need to learn this book, and the message I carry has to be this message. And they conclude by saying, someday we hope AA, OA will help the public to a better realization of the gravity of the alcoholic problem, the compulsive eating problem. But we shall be of little use if our attitude is one of bitterness or hostility. So if we are at a meeting and someone's like sharing and they say something that's like dead wrong, we don't get bitter or hostile. All I'm responsible is carrying a message that I believe is what God wants me to. I'm not responsible for what other people say, and I don't have to start, texting everyone about, can you believe what so-and-so said? No. And they conclude by saying, after all, our problems are of our own making. Remember, selfishness and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of this illness. Bottles were only a symbol. So sometimes a person will say, well, I take the first compulsive bite or I binge, and that's what blocks me off from God. It's like, no, no, no. If you're binging, that's a symptom that you're already blocked off from God. And they conclude by saying, besides, we have stopped fighting anybody or anything. We have to. We don't have to fight. We just have to realize that, like, God has given us this wonderful gift, and it's our privilege and our pleasure to carry it to others. And with that, I will pass.